Constitute document, paragraph, text run, require, docs. Constefs leader require outifs. Constock our new document sections. Children, new paragraph, children. New text run, text. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Horizon and watched the massive alien structure grow larger on the main screen. The thing was huge beyond imagination, like someone had built a city in space and then decided it wasn't big enough. Metal towers twisted upward in impossible spirals while docking bays opened and closed like mouths breathing ships in and out. Morrison had prepared for this moment his entire career, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer scale of what they were approaching. Behind him, Dr. Lisa Park was recording everything with her scientific instruments, while Ambassador Helen Torres reviewed her diplomatic protocols for the 100th time. Commander Rick Stone stood at the security station, with his hand never far from the weapons. Controls, though Morrison doubted their small ships, guns would make much difference against something this size. And the communication officer turned toward Morrison with confusion written across his face. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission, but it's not what we expected." Morrison moved closer to listen. The voice that came through the speakers was flat and bored, like someone reading from a manual they had memorized years ago. "Unknown vessel you are approaching. Imperial Processing Station. Gamma 747. Please transmit your species identification codes and proceed to Docking Bay 2847-C for routine integration processing. Welcome to the Galactic Empire. Have a pleasant standard cycle." And Morrison looked around the bridge at his crew. That was it. No demands for surrender. No warnings about trespassing, no questions about their intentions. Just directions to a parking spot. Torres stepped forward and activated the communication system. "This is Ambassador Helen Torres representing the planet Earth and the human species. We request formal diplomatic contact with representatives of the Galactic Empire." There was a pause before the same bored voice responded. "Please proceed to Docking Bay 2847-C. Integration specialists will process your request during standard business hours. Current wait time is approximately 4.7 standard cycles." And Enstone moved closer to Morrison and spoke quietly. "Captain, this feels like a trap. They're acting like we're expected, like we're just another delivery truck." Morrison nodded but ordered the helmsman to follow the directions anyway. What choice did they have? They had come too far to turn back now. And besides, maybe this was just their version of customs and immigration. And the Docking Bay turned out to be enormous, with ships of every conceivable design coming and going in orderly lines. Some looked like crystalline flowers, while others resembled metallic squids or geometric puzzles that hurt to look at directly. The horizon was guided to a berth between what appeared to be a living tree covered in silver bark, and something that might have been a flying cathedral made of blue glass. As soon as they touched down, a gangway extended from the station and connected to their airlock. A figure appeared at the other end of the gangway, and Morrison had to blink several times to make sure he was seeing correctly. The being looked vaguely humanoid but stretched like someone had taken a person and made them 20% taller and thinner. Its skin had a grayish tint and its eyes were larger than human eyes, but not dramatically so. It wore what appeared to be a uniform that was the same boring beige color as government offices everywhere. Most surprisingly, it looked completely uninterested in meeting them. Being introduced itself as Zeftal the Adequate from the Imperial Integration Office and handed Torres a device that looked like a tablet computer. "These are your standard integration forms. Please complete sections 1 through 47 and return them to processing window 12 on level 7. Next." It turned to leave, but Torres called after it. "Wait. We need to speak with your superiors about establishing diplomatic relations between our species and your empire." Zeftal turned back with the expression of someone who had heard this exact request thousands of times before. "Diplomatic status requires completion of forms 847-A through 847-Z. Current processing time is 312 standard cycles. You may request expedited processing by filing form 848-B, which requires approval." From the Regional Integration Supervisor, Diane Chen Park stepped forward with her scientific curiosity overriding her diplomatic training. "Excuse me, but could you tell us about your species and your empire? We're very interested in learning about galactic civilization." Zeftal looked at her with what might have been mild surprise. "Information packets are available in the waiting area on level 5. Please take queue number 23891 and wait for your number to be called. Standard wait time is currently 6.4 standard cycles, and Morrison felt his temper rising. This was not how first contact was supposed to go. They were explorers and ambassadors representing all of humanity, and they were being treated like they were applying for a driver's license. Look, we've traveled across the galaxy to make contact with your empire. This is a historic moment for both our species. Surely someone in authority would want to meet with us personally. Zeftal checked something on its own tablet device. You are species classification pending review status unknown. Standard protocols apply. Please complete your integration forms and proceed to temporary housing block 847. Meal vouchers are available at the commissary on level 3. Yanyan, with that Zeftal, walked away, leaving the human crew standing in the docking bay holding a stack of forms written in a language they couldn't read. Other beings moved past them with the casual indifference of commuters at a train station. A creature that looked like a walking jellyfish bumped into stone and continued on without acknowledgement. Something that resembled a metallic spider was mopping the floor around their feet, apparently unbothered by their presence. Torres looked down at the forms in her hands. Well, this isn't exactly what we planned for. Stone was scanning the area with professional paranoia. I don't like this, Captain. It's too easy, too casual. Where are the guards, the security checks, the interrogations? Park was already pulling out her translation software. Maybe I can make sense of these forms. At least we're getting data about their bureaucratic systems. And Morrison stared at the massive station around them, watching the endless flow of alien beings going about their daily business. Somewhere in this metal maze were the rulers of a galactic empire that had existed for thousands of years. They commanded technologies beyond human imagination and governed countless worlds and species. And apparently they viewed humanity's first contact as routine paperwork that could wait until next Tuesday. He looked at his crew and made a decision. All right, people, let's figure out their system. We came here to make contact with galactic civilization, and that's exactly what we're going to do, even if we have to fill out every form in the Empire to do it. But something told him that getting the galaxy's attention was going to be much harder than any of them had imagined. Required docs. Packer.to buffer doc. Then, buffer. FSOT write file sync. MNT, user data, outputs, HFY Story. Part 1.docs, buffer. Const document paragraph text run, require as docs. Const fs and require fs. Const doc, new document as sections. Children, new paragraph, children. New text run, text. 3 months had passed since the crew of the Horizon first set foot on processing station Gamma 747, and Morrison was beginning to understand why other species didn't try to escape. Where exactly would they go? The station was part of a network that stretched across the entire galaxy, and every destination looked exactly the same as their current location. Block 847 had become their temporary home, though temporary was apparently a relative term in galactic bureaucracy. Their quarters were comfortable enough in the way that government housing was always comfortable, without being interesting. The walls were the same beige as everything else on the station, and the furniture was designed to accommodate multiple body types, which meant it was perfectly adequate for everyone and ideal for no one. Morrison had tried to personalize his room, but there was something about the place that resisted personality, the way water resisted oil. And Dr. Park had thrown herself into studying the Empire with the enthusiasm of a scientist who had discovered an entirely new form of life. She spent her days in the station's information center reading about galactic history and culture, though reading might not have been the right word since the data was downloaded directly into translation, devices that converted concepts into understandable formats. What she learned fascinated and disturbed her in equal measure. The Galactic Empire wasn't really an empire in any traditional sense. It was more like a cosmic-scale civil service department that had been running on autopilot for so long that no one remembered how to turn it off. Species weren't conquered, they were processed. Worlds weren't invaded, they were cataloged and assigned administrative codes. The entire galaxy was organized like the universe's largest office building, complete with departments that reported to other departments in an endless hierarchy that seemed to serve no purpose except to perpetuate itself. And Torres had been attempting to navigate the diplomatic channels with the patience of someone who had spent years dealing with government bureaucracy, but even her considerable skills were being tested. She had filed requests for meetings with 17 different departments, only to be told that each department could only handle requests that had been pre-approved by 3 other departments. The forms required to get pre-approval were only available from departments that required pre-approval to access. N. Commander Stone had initially assumed that the station's casual security was a trap or a test, but 3 months of careful observation had convinced him that it was exactly what it appeared to be. No one tried to escape because the concept of escape didn't exist in a system where everywhere was essentially the same place. The Empire didn't need guards because it had something much more effective than force. It had bureaucracy so comprehensive that resistance became literally impossible to organize. And their neighbors in Block 847 were a diverse collection of beings in various stages of integration processing. The room next to Morrison's housed a family of creatures that looked like walking crystals, who communicated through patterns of light. They had been waiting for integration approval for 7 standard cycles and seemed perfectly content to wait 7 more. Across the hall lived something that resembled a cross between a dolphin and a houseplant that apparently reproduced by releasing spores when it laughed, which happened frequently during the evening comedy broadcasts, and Jan Morrison had tried repeatedly to speak with Zeftal about expediting their processing, but every conversation followed the same pattern. Zeftal would listen politely to his requests, then explain that expedited processing required forms that weren't available until standard processing was complete. When Morrison asked to speak with Zeftal's supervisor, he was told that supervisor meetings required Form 849-C, which could only be requested by beings who had completed their integration interviews. The integration interview itself was scheduled for sometime in the next 15 to 20 standard cycles, depending on the availability of qualified interviewers. When Morrison asked how many qualified interviewers were available, Zeftal checked its records and informed him that there were currently 3 qualified interviewers for humanoid species in their sector and approximately 47,000 species awaiting interviews. Nelson Park made a discovery that explained much about the Empire's structure. The integration database contained records of over 50,000 species that had gone through the same processing they were experiencing. Of those 50,000, more than 30,000 were listed as extinct, not from war or disease or natural disaster, but from what the records clinically described as cultural dissolution. They had simply stopped being distinct species and had become generic members of galactic society. And the pattern was always the same. A species would be discovered, processed, assigned roles based on their apparent capabilities, and gradually their unique culture would fade as they adapted to imperial standards. Within a few generations, they would be indistinguishable from thousands of other species performing similar functions across the galaxy. The Empire didn't destroy civilizations. It absorbed them so completely that they forgot they had ever been anything. Elstad and Torres finally managed to get a meeting with someone who claimed to have authority, though. Authority was another relative term in the imperial hierarchy. Assistant Deputy Coordinator Clefton was a being that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts of 3 different species, and spoke in the same flat, bureaucratic tone that seemed to be universal among imperial officials. Not then, and Clefton informed Torres that humanity had been classified as standard aggressive species, subcategory 847 variant B, which qualified them for basic labor and entertainment services. Their world had been designated as Class M agricultural, with minor industrial capacity, and would be assigned an appropriate development supervisor once the paperwork was processed. Torres asked what this meant in practical terms and was told that humans would be given jobs in food service, hospitality, and manual labor sectors where their emotional volatility could be channeled into useful productivity. When Torres protested that humans were capable of much more than service work, Clefton displayed what appeared to be genuine confusion. The assessment had been completed by qualified evaluators using standard imperial protocols. If humans believed their capabilities had been incorrectly assessed, they could file an appeal using Form 850-A through 850-M, though such appeals typically took several hundred cycles to process and were rarely successful. Ingen Morrison found himself standing in the station's main observation deck watching The endless flow of ships and beings going about their daily routines. Somewhere out there was a galaxy full of wonders beyond human imagination, but none of it seemed to matter to anyone. The Empire had turned exploration into paperwork, discovery into data entry, and wonder into work orders. He thought about Earth and the billions of people waiting to hear about humanity's place in galactic civilization, and realized he had no idea what to tell them. Sharnstone joined him at the observation window and spoke quietly. "Captain, I've been thinking about something. Every species we've met here accepts this system without question. They adapt to their assigned roles and seem genuinely content with their lives." Morrison nodded. "That's what worries me, Rick. What if this is just how advanced civilizations work? What if the adventure and exploration we dreamed about are just primitive impulses that species grow out of?" Stone was quiet for a moment before responding. "Maybe that's true for other species, Captain, but I don't think it's true for us." Lum. Require docx. Packer dot to buffer doc. Then buffer. Sac fs dot write file sync mnt user data outputs HFY Story part 2 docx buffer. Const. Document paragraph. Text run golf require docs. Const fs cur require fs. Doc new document sections. Children. New paragraph. Children. New text run. Text. The transport ship that carried them to integration facility Omega 847 was exactly what Morrison had come to expect from Imperial efficiency. Clean, functional, and soul-crushingly boring. The facility itself looked like someone had designed the galaxy's largest corporate training center, and then forgotten to include anything that might inspire enthusiasm or hope. Low buildings stretched across a perfectly manicured landscape under an artificial sky that was always the same pleasant shade of blue. Dannon Morrison and his crew were not alone anymore. The transport had brought 300 humans from Earth, all volunteers who had answered the call for colonists and explorers. They wore the same excited expressions that Morrison remembered having months ago, and he found himself wondering how long it would take for that excitement to fade into resignation. And among the new arrivals was Dr. Amy Chaney, brilliant physicist who had given up tenure at MIT for the chance to study alien technology. There was Lieutenant Ben Carter, a decorated pilot, who had dreamed of flying among the stars since childhood. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had commanded merchant vessels across Earth's oceans and hoped to do the same among the planets. All of them were about to discover that their dreams didn't match the Empire's needs assessment, and the orientation process began immediately with efficiency that would have impressed any corporate trainer. Groups of humans were sorted by skill sets and assigned to various training programs. Morrison watched Dr. Chen being directed toward a module titled Basic Beverage Service, while Lieutenant Carter was handed materials for tour guide certification level 1. Captain Rodriguez found herself in a group learning hospitality management for diverse species. NNN had managed to access the Empire's species database during their months on the processing station, and what she found there was sobering. The humans were being trained for exactly the roles that thousands of other species had been assigned throughout galactic history. Food service, entertainment, and basic labor were, apparently, the Empire's solution for most newly integrated civilizations. Known Torres attempted to meet with the facility's administrators to discuss alternative arrangements, but found herself caught in the same bureaucratic maze that had trapped them at the processing station. Every request required forms that could only be obtained from offices that were only open during hours, when other required offices were closed. The system wasn't designed to be navigated, it was designed to be endured. Anna and Morrison tried a different approach. Instead of working within the system, he decided to challenge it directly. He requested a meeting with the facility's review board and was surprised when his request was actually approved. The meeting was scheduled for the following week in conference room 847-B, which was apparently the Imperial designation for every conference room in existence. The review board consisted of 3 beings who looked like they had been chosen specifically to represent the Empire's diversity. One resembled a walking flower with petals that changed color as it spoke. Another looked like a geometric puzzle made of crystal and metal. The third was humanoid, but with skin that shifted between different shades of blue. All 3 spoke in the same flat bureaucratic tone that seemed to be taught in Imperial administrative schools. Annan Morrison had prepared carefully for this meeting. He brought examples of human art, music, literature, and scientific achievements. He demonstrated mathematical concepts and philosophical ideas. He showed them recordings of human exploration and discovery. The board listened politely, took notes, and then explained that 34,891 other species had similar achievements and were already fulfilling creative and intellectual roles in galactic society, and the waiting list for positions in the creative species category was currently 23,000 cycles long. Humans could file an application to be considered for such positions, but would need to demonstrate exceptional capabilities beyond those of the species already performing such functions. The assessment process typically took several centuries and required approval from the Regional Creative Council, which met once every 50 standard cycles. And N. Park tried a different argument. She presented her research on the Empire's technological stagnation, pointing out that, despite processing hundreds of new species over the past millennium, the Empire had made virtually no significant advances in any field. Innovation required diversity of thought and approach, but the Empire's classification system eliminated that diversity by forcing all species into predetermined roles. The board considered her arguments with the same polite attention they had given Morrison's presentation. They explained that the Empire's current technology was sufficient for all identified needs and that further innovation was unnecessary. Stability and efficiency were more valuable than progress and change. The Empire had achieved a perfect balance that had maintained peace and prosperity for thousands of years. And Commander Stone made an observation that seemed to genuinely puzzle the board. He pointed out that the Empire's greatest weakness wasn't its bureaucracy, but its inability to handle anyone who refused to follow the established procedures. When he suggested that humanity might simply choose to leave Imperial space and develop their own civilization, the response was confusion rather than anger. The concept of voluntary departure from the Empire was so unprecedented that the board had to consult their procedures manual several times. They finally explained that such an action would require approval from the Galactic Council, which would need to review the request for potential impacts on Imperial stability. Such a review would take approximately 5,000 standard cycles and would require humanity to maintain their current status. During the evaluation period, Annan Morrison found himself laughing despite the frustration. The Empire had created a system so comprehensive that even leaving required permission that would never be granted. It was bureaucracy as a form of gravity, holding everything in place not through force but through sheer procedural mass. But something in his laughter seemed to disturb the board members more than any of his arguments had. The meeting ended with a compromise that Morrison recognized immediately as a trap. The board offered humanity a new classification as catalyst species, with the responsibility of helping other newly integrated species adapt to Imperial life. It was presented as a promotion, but Morrison understood that it was really an attempt to turn humanity's rebellious nature into a tool for maintaining Imperial control. After the board members left, Morrison sat alone in conference room 847-B thinking about their offer. They wanted to use human stubbornness to help other species accept their assigned roles. They wanted to turn humanity's refusal to give up into a way of making everyone else give up more efficiently. It was clever in its own bureaucratic way, but it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. Ensign Torres found him there an hour later, still sitting at the conference table. "So what do we tell them?" she asked. Morrison looked up at her and smiled for the first time in months. "We tell them yes," he said. "We accept their offer to be catalyst species." Torres looked confused. "Jake, that's exactly what they want us to do." Morrison's smile widened. "Helen, that's exactly what they think they want us to do. But humans have never been very good at being anyone else's tool, and I don't think we're going to start now." "Oh. Require docs. Packer to buffer doc. Then, buffer. Were, fstot write file sync. MNT user data, outputs HFY Story. Part 3.docs, buffer. Copy procedure document, paragraph, text run. Guys require her docs. Constefs on require Fs. Const doc reactor new document in sections. Children. New paragraph. Children. New text run. Text. The message that arrived at Morrison's quarters was unlike any official communication he had received during their months in the Imperial system. Instead of the usual bureaucratic language, it was brief and direct. Report to Central Administration Level 1000 for immediate consultation with Grand Administrator Velthok. Morrison had heard the name whispered in conversations among the facility staff, but he had assumed Velthok was either a myth or a figurehead whose actual existence was irrelevant to daily operations. Known the journey to Level 1000 required special transport authorization and took them through parts of the facility that Morrison hadn't known existed. The corridors became progressively more elaborate as they rose higher through the building, until they reached areas that looked more like ancient temples than administrative offices. The walls were covered with symbols from thousands of different species, and the air itself seemed to hum with accumulated authority. And Grand Administrator Velthok was not what Morrison had expected. Instead of the imposing figure, he had imagined he found himself facing a being that looked tired in a way that transcended species boundaries. Velthok was tall and thin with skin that seemed to shift between different textures and colors, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its eyes were ancient in a way that made Morrison feel like a child, even though he knew the being was probably older than human civilization. Ando. Grand Administrator's office was larger than some city blocks and filled with artifacts from across the galaxy. Morrison recognized some objects that appeared to be from Earth, though he couldn't imagine how they had gotten there. Velthok gestured for him to sit in a chair that adjusted itself automatically to his body, shape, and then settled behind a desk that seemed to be carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight. And your species has caused considerable disruption in our processing systems, Velthok said without preamble. Morrison had expected anger or threats, but the Grand Administrator's tone was more curious than hostile. In the past 6 months, we have received more complaint forms, more appeal requests, and more procedural challenges than we typically process in a standard century. Our efficiency ratings are beginning to decline. And Morrison straightened in his chair. I'm sorry if we've caused problems, but we're just trying to understand our place in your empire and ensure that our species is given appropriate opportunities. Velthok made a sound that might have been laughter. Appropriate opportunities. Do you have any idea how many species have used those exact words in this very office? Morrison felt a chill but pressed on. Then maybe the problem isn't with the species but with the system that keeps producing the same complaints. The Grand Administrator was quiet for so long that Morrison began to wonder if he had overstepped some crucial boundary. Finally, Velthok spoke again, and its voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on the room itself. I have overseen the integration of 847 species into this empire. I have seen civilizations that could manipulate matter at the quantum level, and others that had achieved forms of consciousness we still don't understand. All of them went through the same process you are experiencing, and all of them eventually found their place in our system. And Morrison leaned forward. But what if finding their place meant losing everything that made them unique? What if your system is so efficient at integration that it destroys the very things that made those species worth integrating in the first place? Velthok's eyes focused on him with an intensity that made him feel like his thoughts were being read and catalogued. You believe your species is different from all the others? No, Morrison said, surprising himself with his honesty. I think all species are different from each other, and that's exactly what makes them valuable. Your system treats diversity like a problem to be solved instead of a resource to be cultivated. You're so focused on efficiency that you've forgotten why efficiency matters in the first place. And Velthok stood and walked to one of the massive windows that looked out over the facility. Morrison could see thousands of beings moving through the complex below, following their assigned routines with mechanical precision. The Grand Administrator spoke without turning around. What would you have us do? Allow chaos. Permit species to choose their own roles regardless of their capabilities. Let them pursue paths that lead to conflict and inefficiency. And Morrison joined him at the window. Why not let them try? If they fail, they'll learn from their mistakes and try something else. If they succeed, you'll have discovered new possibilities you never considered. Either way, you'll have species that are engaged and motivated instead of just obedient. The conversation was interrupted by an aide who entered with obvious urgency. Grand Administrator, we're receiving reports from across the galaxy. Multiple species are filing formal challenges to their classifications. The Kethari have organized work stoppages in 17 mining sectors. The Velgoth Agricultural Council is demanding representation in planetary management decisions. Morrison felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. It was beginning. Velthok listened to the reports with an expression that might have been resignation or relief. When the aide finished, he dismissed them with a gesture and turned back to Morrison. "This is your influence at work, isn't it? You've been teaching other species to question the system." Morrison nodded. "We've been sharing our experiences and our approaches to problem solving. Apparently other species have their own ideas about what they'd like to do with their lives." Yan Grand Administrator returned to his desk and activated what appeared to be a communication system that connected him to offices across the Empire. Morrison listened as reports came in from dozens of sectors describing various forms of organized dissatisfaction. For the first time in recorded Imperial history, multiple species were simultaneously challenging their assigned roles and demanding alternatives. And Velthok's response surprised Morrison completely. Instead of ordering suppression of the unrest, he issued instructions to regional administrators to begin developing alternative assignment protocols. Instead of rejecting the appeals, he authorized reviews of species classifications that hadn't been updated in centuries. Instead of punishing the organizers, he established new positions for species advocacy coordinators. And, when the communications ended, Velthok looked at Morrison with what might have been respect. "You have accomplished something remarkable, Captain Morrison. You have forced an empire that prides itself on having seen everything to acknowledge that it might have been wrong about a few things. The question now is what we do with this disruption you've created." Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "We help other species find their own voices instead of just amplifying ours. We teach them that asking questions isn't rebellion, it's growth. We show them that there's a difference between being part of something and being consumed by it." Chanvel. Thok activated another communication device and Morrison heard his own voice being broadcast across the Empire. "Attention all integrated species. By order of the Grand Administrator, new protocols are being established for species reclassification and role reassignment. Any species wishing to explore alternative contributions to Imperial society may file Form 900-A for expedited review." Morrison realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. An empire was learning to change. Memo. Require docs. Packer.toBuffer.doc. Then, buffer. Cure. Fs.write file sync. MNT user data outputs HFY Story. Part 4.docs. Buffer. Const document paragraph text run. Require docs. Const fsmarn require fs. Const doc a new document or sections. Children. New paragraph. Children. New text run 9 text these 6 months after the grandeur. Administrator's unprecedented announcement. The Imperial Integration Office had transformed from a monument to bureaucratic efficiency into something that resembled organized chaos. Morrison stood in what had once been Processing Station Gamma 747, watching beings from across the galaxy participate in something the Empire had never seen before. A job fair done in the station's sterile corridors now buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with forms or procedures. Species that had been assigned to food service for generations were presenting proposals for artistic collaborations. Mining specialists were sharing ideas about terraforming techniques with agricultural engineers. The crystalline Zarbeth, who had always worked in isolation, were discovering the benefits of cooperative research with the tentacled Fluxhi, whose scent-based communication added new dimensions to their data analysis. And Dr. Park had become something she had never imagined possible in the rigid Imperial system. She was now Director of Interspecies Innovation at the galaxy's first integrated university. Her initial anthropological studies had evolved into something much larger as she worked with beings from thousands of different worlds to share knowledge that had been segregated by bureaucratic boundaries for millennia. Her most popular course wasn't about human culture, but about the art of asking questions that no one had thought to ask before. University itself was housed in what had been Administrative Block 847, but now looked more like a living organism than a government building. Classrooms had been redesigned to accommodate everything from gaseous life forms to beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The library had become a nexus where information flowed freely between species that had never communicated directly before. Ambassador. Torres had found her true calling in something the Empire had never needed before. She was now chief coordinator of the Galactic Workers Collective, an organization that represented the interests of species across the Empire in their dealings with Imperial management. Their first major victory had been establishing the concept of overtime pay for beings required to work more than 200 hours per week. Their current project was even more ambitious. They were working to establish the fundamental right of all sentient beings to choose their own work assignments. The Collective's headquarters occupied 17 levels of what had been the Imperial Compliance Center. The irony wasn't lost on Torres that she was now using the Empire's own meeting rooms to organize challenges to Imperial authority. But the real surprise was how quickly other species had embraced the concept of collective bargaining once they understood that they had the right to negotiate rather than simply accept whatever assignments they were given. Eastern Commander Stone had made a discovery that was changing the Empire in ways no one had anticipated. The Imperial security system wasn't designed to prevent rebellion because the Empire had never experienced organized resistance. But it also wasn't designed to prevent reform because the Empire had never experienced organized cooperation. Stone's new role as Director of Administrative Liberation involved helping Imperial officials escape from the bureaucratic systems that had trapped them for centuries. His most significant success had been Grand Administrator Velthok himself. The ancient being had been confined to his office for over 10,000 years, not by force but by the procedural requirements of his position. The paperwork required for even a brief absence was so complex that it had never been completed. Stone's team had spent 3 months developing a streamlined approval process that allowed Velthok to leave his office. For the first time since most current civilizations had developed writing. And Morrison's own transformation had been the most surprising of all. His new title was Director of Species Integration Innovation, but his real job was something the Empire had never had before. He was a professional troublemaker whose responsibility was to identify and challenge systems that prevented beings from reaching their potential. Instead of fitting species into predetermined roles, he worked to create new roles that matched what species actually wanted to do. The position had been created specifically for him after it became clear that traditional Imperial classifications simply didn't apply to humans. They were too stubborn to be efficient workers, too curious to be satisfied with routine tasks, and too optimistic to accept that things couldn't be improved. Rather than trying to change humanity to fit the system, Velthok had decided to change the system to accommodate humanity and anyone else who shared their inconvenient tendency to expect better. The transformation wasn't universal, and it wasn't without problems. Many species preferred the security and predictability of the old system and chose to maintain their traditional roles. Several sectors had experienced temporary disruptions as beings explored new possibilities before discovering that their original assignments had been appropriate after all. But for the first time in Imperial history, choice was an option rather than an impossibility. Morrison stood on the observation deck of what was now called the Opportunity Center, watching new ships arrive from across the galaxy. The processing procedures were still there, but they had been fundamentally altered. Instead of forms that assigned beings to predetermined categories, there were consultations that explored what individuals and species hoped to accomplish. Instead of waiting rooms, there were collaboration spaces where beings could meet others with similar interests. Thok joined him at the observation window, moving with the careful wonder of someone experiencing freedom for the first time in millennia. The Grand Administrator had been touring the galaxy for weeks, visiting worlds and installations he had only known through reports and statistics. His discoveries had been revelation after revelation as he saw firsthand how his empire actually functioned rather than how the paperwork said it functioned. And in you, Captain Morrison, the Grand Administrator, said, "There's something I never told you about our first meeting." Morrison looked at him curiously. "For 10,000 years I have been waiting for someone to walk into my office and tell me that our system was wrong. Not inefficient, not imperfect, but fundamentally wrong in its basic assumptions about what beings want from their lives." Morrison, was quiet for a moment, watching a group of young beings from a dozen different species working together on what appeared to be an art project that involved controlled gravitational fields. Why didn't you change things yourself if you knew they were wrong? Velthok's expression was difficult to read, but Morrison thought he detected something like sadness. Because I had forgotten that change was possible. I had been part of the system for so long that I couldn't imagine anything else. Existing. An NHSNA chime sounded, indicating the arrival of another transport, full of beings ready to explore their possibilities in a galaxy that was finally learning to ask what they wanted to do, instead of telling them what they had to do. Morrison smiled as he watched the new arrivals being greeted not by bored bureaucrats but by enthusiastic coordinators who were genuinely excited to help them discover their potential. Gentian, sometimes, the most human thing you can do, Morrison thought, is refuse. To accept that boring has to mean hopeless. The galaxy was still vast and full of bureaucracy, but now it was also full of possibility. And that made all the paperwork worthwhile. Require docs. Packer to buffer doc. Then, buffer. FS write file sync. MNT user data outputs. HFY story, part 5 docs, buffer.